So let's get on with it then, eh? Now, I have been using what they call artificial intelligence for these images, and it's certainly artificial, but whether it's intelligent is a moot point. But anyway, the point I'm making there is that it's hard to believe today, but if you went back to the 13th century, you would have found something very different at Hampton Court Palace. And you wouldn't have seen the kind of magnificent complex of Tudor and Stuart buildings, but a medieval manor run by the Knights Hospitaller under the direction of the priory at Clerkenwell. Now, you may know about the priory at Clerkenwell. There's just a gatehouse there, massively restored by the Victorians. That's all left of what was once the mighty priory of St. John at Clerkenwell. And there is a crypt underneath it, though, if you want to go and visit it. But anyway, the Knights Hospitaller at Hampton Manor were basically responding to the priory at Clerkenwell, the mothership. Hampton Court had been a manor owned by a chap called Sir Walter de St. Valery, according to the Domesday Book. And he went off on the First Crusade with Robert of Normandy, who was the eldest son of William the Conqueror. Now, having fought with William the Conqueror at Hastings, as you know, the Saxons lost, the Normans won, and so Sir Walter was given a couple of places to own in England, namely Hampton and Isleworth, and a few bits of Suffolk as well into the bargain. So that was the price for being loyal to William the Conqueror. Now, Walter probably never lived there. His main residence was on the other side of the English Channel, but it was in the family for a couple of generations, and then in 1237, it was donated to the Knights Hospitaller. Now, if you might know, but a lot of nobles in Europe donated property and wealth to the Knights Hospitaller and to the Knights Templar, and this was to support what they were doing in the Holy Land, which was obviously taking Jerusalem in the year 1099, setting up 4 Crusader kingdoms, and in order to ensure that the Crusaders held on to those kingdoms, nobles and wealthy people across Europe made big donations. So effectively, Hampton was donated to the Knights Hospitaller. So, what were they up to at Hampton? Well, what they were doing across Europe was basically running what we would today call kind of agri-businesses. And this is kind of like, these were kind of big farms, basically. Cows, sheep, buttery, dovecot, fish pond, all that kind of stuff. What they were doing was creating wealth from the land to fund what they were doing in the Holy Land. And both the Hospitallers and the Templars had this network of commanderies across Europe. So Hampton was one of these. And in 1338, the Hospitallers conducted an audit of their properties in England. And the Manor of Hampton, I've got it here, had 800 acres of arable land, 40 acres of meadow, pasture for 24 oxen, hope you're all taking notes, 18 cows, 10 store cattle, 2,000 sheep, a fish pond, and a pigeon house. So, it's a substantial operation. It wasn't a backwater, and it was also functioning as a kind of hotel for noble guests on their way to Sheen Palace during the reigns of Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, and Richard II, so the later Plantagenets. And the community at Hampton Court, even though that's all male up there, was actually mixed, apparently, men and women. Most would have been men, but the women were nuns, and the lay people working there would have been mainly non-knights. So most of the Hospitallers went knights. They were sergeants, they were grunts, they were serfs. They were people just working in a farming environment. Now, I'm told, by the way, that the bell which hangs over the astronomical clock at Hampton Court Palace today is the oldest artifact at the palace. And that bell once hung over the Hospitallers' chapel. So take a closer look at that when you see it. And in recent years, human remains have been found in Chapel Court, north of the present Chapel Royal. And it's believed that these are either Hospitallers or the people who worked for them, but they're from around that time. Anyway, by the time of the Tudors, the Hospitallers had leased out the buildings to private landowners, and under Henry VII, the first Tudor king, they granted an 80-year lease to the king's Lord Chamberlain, who was a chap called Sir Giles Daubeny. Now, after he died, of course, as you know, the estate was acquired by a certain Cardinal Wolsey, and the rest is Tudor history, as you know. Now, for the Hospitallers, I'm not saying it all ended up like that for them, but they were part monk, part soldier, a bit like the Templars. Not strictly speaking monks, definitely soldiers, but they were a creation of medieval Roman Catholicism. So they were knights who observed a monastic rule. They lived like monks. They were identified heavily with the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, under Henry VIII, with the Reformation, that proved to be their undoing. So under Henry VIII, the Hospitallers were dissolved, as you know, with all the other monasteries in England. In fact, my partner and I were up in Yorkshire in June. I think you were there as well. And we went to see Fountains Abbey, if you've ever been there, Cistercian Abbey. Some of these magnificent ruined abbeys that you get around England. Well, what happened to the Cistercians and the Augustinians and the Benedictines? Same thing happened to the Hospitallers. They were dissolved. Dissolved sounds an awful thing to happen, but it's basically they were wound up and told to stop and go away. Most of the Hospitallers in London went to their stronghold of Malta, more on that in a moment, but 3 who refused did end up being executed, one of them being hanged, drawn, and quartered. I'll spare you the details. Let's say he's the one who was hanged, drawn, and quartered, but in fact I believe that his arm was actually nailed to the gate at Clerkenwell as a warning, basically, to the other Hospitallers to say, don't come back. Now, there we are. I got artificial intelligence. I said, artificial intelligence, give me Templars and Hospitallers. And there we are. Looks a bit Vivian Westwood-like, but it's a good effort by the... So that's basically, you have the Knights Templar, obviously the white mantle, the red cross. I think artificial intelligence got confused there because actually the knights had a red mantle and the sergeants had a black mantle. So that's artificial intelligence getting confused there. But basically, difference in dress that would have distinguished them on the battlefield. So in the Holy Land, when the Templars were charging out, you would have known it was the Templars, flowing white mantles, red cross. When the Hospitallers charged out, you would have known it was them, red mantles, white cross, yeah? Boop. Now, in fact, the Knights Hospitaller, there's a bit of an argument about when they started, but I'm going to go along with the view that they predated the Knights Templar. They emerged decades before in the 11th century, running in what effect was both a hospital and a hostel for Christian pilgrims who were visiting Jerusalem. And the building they used had originally been a monastery dedicated to St. John the Baptist, hence it was the Order of St. John. And the full name of the Hospitallers was the Order of St. John of the Hospital of Jerusalem. That's a mouthful, so they're just the Hospitallers. And so what they did originally, at the beginning, the Hospitallers, after the year 1099 in particular, when the Crusaders seized Jerusalem, as you know, in the First Crusade, the Crusaders turned up, they took Jerusalem, they ended Muslim rule there, 400 years of Muslim rule, in a very bloody siege, which the chroniclers at the time enjoyed describing, saying the blood was splashing up from the streets and onto their stirrups, and wasn't it great fun? We had such a good massacre. And so in 1099, they basically took the city of Jerusalem, the Crusaders, and the Hospitallers, who were, strictly speaking, already there running a hospital, were now not just treating pilgrims, but also treating soldiers and others who were now involved in running the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. So what we get with the Hospitallers is a kind of, is it mission creep? Is that the right view? Yeah, same with the Templars. But, I mean, the Templars started out officially as offering a kind of escort service for pilgrims. The Hospitallers started out running a hospital. Both of them basically, once the Crusader kingdoms were established, got into the business of fighting, basically. And the reason the Hospitallers and the Templars were so popular with the Crusader rulers in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and Tripoli, was that unlike secular knights, unlike most knights who went home at the end of the campaigning season, unlike knights who were thinking, I wonder what my wife is doing right now, maybe I better go home and find out. Unlike them, the Templars and the Hospitallers stayed. They were like a professionalized army. They had their own rule book, their own ethos, organizational structure, and they acted in concert. They acted in unison. Something quite new, something quite dynamic, something very attractive to the people ruling the Holy Land. So the Hospitallers had an organizational structure with a Grand Master, Grand Commander, Marshal of the Hospital, and then 3 ranks of Hospitallers. So you had knights, men-at-arms, and the chaplains. The chaplains administered the sacraments. So most of the Knights Hospitaller didn't have the prerogative to administer sacraments. You know, they led a monastic existence, but they couldn't give somebody Holy Communion. They weren't proper priests, so they had to have their own priests. There were also secular knights who joined the order temporarily. So you could join the order as a kind of ancillary knight without becoming a full-blown Hospitaller. I think I'll join for this season, but I'm going to leave at the end of it. Yeah? So these knights were distinct, as I said, from secular knights in that they didn't go home, they stuck around, they observed the monastic rule of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So the Templars and Hospitallers, like monks, prayed at intervals, and as you know, all the intervals of prayer that monks observe. I mean, to be honest with you, God, it must have been really horrible, frankly. You get up at the crack of dawn, first round of prayers. You know, you've been up a couple of hours, another round of prayers. Then another round of prayers, 5, 6 of them during the day. In between time, you're conducting military drills, you're cleaning your equipment, and you might even be getting attacked. Not for me, I have to say. The Hospitallers, now the Hospitallers were guaranteed a large degree of independence from the church, from the local church authorities and the local secular authorities. Same with the Templars. So successive popes, and I know now, so people are going to say, hang on, that's the Vatican today. Back in the Middle Ages, it would have been old St. Peter's. You see, that's the limits of artificial intelligence. It doesn't know that, but anyway. But successive popes basically granted a series of privileges to the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar. This came to be resented over time by local church authorities and local secular authorities who said, why can't we control these knights over here? But they were directly answerable only to the Pope in Rome. So in 1113, 5 years before the Templars came on the scene, Pope Paschal II issued a papal bull, which is like a papal declaration, a law, a statement with obviously, the sacred power that the Pope has behind it. And this bull was called Pie Postulatio Voluntatis. Takes you back to Latin class, isn't it? Anybody know what that means? No? Pie Postulatio Voluntatis, the most pious request. And that recognized the Hospitallers and ensured their sovereignty over their own affairs. Now, initially, the Hospitallers followed the Benedictine rule. A lot of the early Hospitallers were associated with the Benedictines in the same way that a lot of the Templars were associated with the Cistercians. But eventually they had their own rule, written in Latin and Old French, that reflected their changing status as military warriors in the Holy Land. But this is what makes them different from ordinary secular knights. Secular knights turn up, their own gear, colors of their family, charging into battle, freelancing a bit on the battlefield. Not the Hospitallers, not the Templars. They're operating to a rule book. They're highly disciplined. They've got this organizational structure, first into battle, last out, all that kind of thing. Something quite different from what had been experienced before. And as you may know, the Hospitallers and the Templars had some amazing fortresses in the Holy Land. And this one here is Crac des Chevaliers, and that's what it looks like today in Syria. Sadly, it's in Syria, so it's unlikely for the moment that many of us will be able to... Has anybody been to it, by the way? Ah, I'm very jealous. What did you think of it?
1992. Doing something with the Lido.
Oh, yeah.
So we were taking a friend and I went to my cars. I always wanted to see it. It was magnificent. I mean, you just
And it's so huge. I mean, it's just...
absolutely huge.
Yeah.
We would take around like an Estonian, and so it was into all sorts of nooks and crannies, but it was amazing.
Oh, I mean, I'm so jealous. I mean, obviously, I dawdled and diddled years ago, should have gone, and of course, yeah, the Syrian civil war came along, and as you may know, I think about 10 years ago, it actually took a bit of a bombardment. I think it was the Free Syrian Army and Assad's people were fighting, and the Free Syrian Army was, I think it was the FSA, was holed up in there, and there was, some damage done to the chapel. So, ironically, it is still involved as a theatre of war, but mercifully, it seems to be still pretty much in one piece. And the Hospitallers were there from 1142 to 1271, after which it was conquered by the Mamluks. Now, this is one. Now, I have been here, thank God. Have you been Acre, in Israel? Anybody? You've been there? Yeah? Did you like it? Yeah. Did you go down the tunnel? Did you go into the tunnel? Was the tunnel there at the time? Or? No. But it's a lovely, yeah, it's a very atmospheric, isn't it? Yeah. So the Israeli name for the place is Akko, but in the Middle Ages it was Acre. So this is another huge fortress in the Crusader stronghold of Acre, and this is what they call the Knights' Hall. And much of this was only discovered, I think in the 1990s, it was discovered. It's basically full of refuse for many years. So I'm dramatizing this a bit, or AI is, but basically, as the Crusades faltered in the Holy Land, the Pope in the early 14th century was a chap called Clement. Now, Clement was, many of the popes in the Middle Ages couldn't actually live in Rome. And the reason for that is there was often a rival pope in Rome saying, no, I'm the real pope, referred to as the anti-pope, and sometimes there were three. So what happened was that in the early 14th century, the pope that eventually came to be regarded as the legitimate pope was actually living in Avignon. I don't know if anybody's been to Avignon. That's more like it. And there is a lovely, of course, there's the papal palace there. Well, that was the palace from where Pope Clement was running the Catholic Church. Unfortunately for Pope Clement, the King of France was up the road, and the King of France was a rather overbearing chap called Philip the Fair. Why he was called Philip the Fair is Philip the Unfair would have been a more appropriate name. But anyway, he was up the road, and he basically was pressuring Clement to get, first of all, the idea was to get the Templars and the Hospitallers to merge. As they'd lost the Holy Land, they'd retreated off the Holy Land to Cyprus. The Hospitallers would then go to Rhodes and finally Malta. But they'd lost the Crusades out there. And of course, many monarchs and nobles and bishops across Europe were saying, well, hang on a moment, if the Knights Hospitaller have lost, and if the Templars have lost, then we don't want to give them any money. We'd like to have some of that money back, thank you very much, and maybe they could merge. Well, both orders said no. The Templars said no louder, and that might have sealed their fate shortly afterwards, because there's a Templar sitting on a stash of dollar bills, because Philip the Fair, unfortunately for the Templars, was short on cash, and the Templars seemed to have rather a lot of money. Now, both the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller were engaged in the medieval version of high finance. They often were involved in running the state's finances. They were running themselves a pretty sophisticated financial operation in all these commanderies, funneling money to the Holy Land. They even were allowed on occasions to collect taxes on behalf of the king, on behalf of the Pope. But it's the Templars who particularly seem to have got the attention of the King of France, and he decided that his wars with England were costing a lot of money, and he rather needed the Templars' money. Now, he's shaken down the abbeys already, he's shaken down the Jewish community, so he came for the Templars. And it's been a kind of source of intrigue as to why the Hospitallers survived at this time and the Templars didn't, but it's definitely the Templars that got shut down, arrested, imprisoned, tortured, their Grand Master burnt at the stake in front of Notre Dame, while the Hospitallers just kind of breathed through. Not only did they breathe through, they even managed to get their hands on a lot of the Templar assets, a lot of the Templar assets that were given to the Hospitallers. So in effect, it wasn't so much a merger in the end as a hostile takeover. Now, who knows? You know all the stories about the Knights Templar digging for treasure. You know all these esoteric theories about, did they find the Holy Grail? Did they find the Ark of the Covenant? I've been on TV programs. People have put a gun to my head and forced me to talk about these things for money. And basically, wouldn't it be lovely to think that the Knights Hospitaller got their hands on well, we probably shouldn't even. Here we are. This is my. I asked AI. I said, give me an image of a Knight Hospitaller greedily seizing some Knight Templar treasure, and that's what AI came up with. There you are. There you are. Maybe, I imagine that's got the Holy Grail in it. So, as the Holy Land was lost, the Knights Hospitaller retreated to Cyprus, built up a powerful fleet. Though the politics of Cyprus was pretty ugly, and the population there didn't particularly like the Hospitallers or the Templars, and they moved their operation basically to Rhodes, which they seized off the Byzantine Empire. They also, if any of you have been to Bodrum in Turkey on a holiday? Well, Bodrum, which of course originally was Halicarnassus, where the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, was. If you've been there, you'll notice that the mausoleum of Halicarnassus is about this high now, because one of the reasons being the Knights Hospitaller took all the stone to go and create a castle by the port, which is still there. The mausoleum's not there, but the castle still is. And it's kind of sad in a way, but hey, that's history for you. So they had Rhodes, they had Halicarnassus, but ultimately they then moved to Malta. And by 1522, the Ottomans were taking a great deal of interest in Malta, which they saw as the gateway to Europe. Now, the Ottomans, who were the Ottomans? The Ottoman Empire, centered on what is now Turkey, was the Turkic Empire that basically ended the Byzantine Empire. It was the empire that took the whole of Turkey, the Levant, North Africa, the Balkans, got to the gates of Vienna, all this happening basically in the 16th century. So by now, the Knights Hospitaller, no longer in the Holy Land, because that's all now being ruled by the Ottoman Empire, they're in Malta, and the Ottomans are seen as this unstoppable force. This is at the time of the Tudors, the time of Shakespeare. So the deadly Turk is at the door and is going to come and end Christian Europe. So basically, in 1565, the Knights Hospitaller are in Malta, and they are being besieged by a vast Ottoman army. And the whole of Europe is looking to the Hospitallers at Malta and saying, are you going to be able to stop this 40,000 strong Ottoman force, you 500 knights in Malta? Good luck. Bonne chance. And Queen Elizabeth I actually even wrote, she said, let's get Queen Elizabeth I up, there she is. We said, if the Turks should prevail against the Isle of Malta, it is uncertain what further peril might follow to the rest of Christendom. And then she wrote, P.S., you're not getting any more money out of me because you're a bunch of Catholics, goodbye. So, but the Hospitallers were seen as the last line before the Ottomans. Now, in fairness, the Spanish, various Italian kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire were also involved in supporting the Hospitallers, but really they were going to take the full brunt of this attack. And in 1551, the Turks took something like 5,000 captives from the nearby island of Gozo into captivity, and then basically said, you're next to Malta. How many of you have been to Malta? Marvelous. It's the first time I'd never been until last year, and of course what you appreciate is the amazing connections to Britain, obviously the Second World War connections, but also the Knights Hospitaller. Their presence, you can see it everywhere on the island, the various houses that were run by different nations within the Knights Hospitaller, the langues, they call it the tongues. So you have the Aragonese Knights Hospitaller had one building, and the French had another building, and so on. But Malta really was land of the Hospitallers in the 16th century. Only the Turks decided it shouldn't be, so they turned up in order to destroy Hospitaller control. And the Hospitallers were led by a Frenchman at that time called Jean de Valette. Now, that may seem familiar. Valletta, yeah. And that reflects really the very international profile of the Knights Hospitaller. So they faced the biggest Turkish fleet ever seen, a force of 40,000 versus, it's estimated in total about 6,000 Hospitallers and their allies from France, Spain, and Italy. And the siege really is, I didn't know much about the siege of Malta, really, until I went to Malta. And I didn't appreciate really what an astonishing event it is that, we just don't get taught at school. It's something that's been largely forgotten. But it's an incredible story of both valor and horror, because up to a third of the population of Malta were basically either killed or badly wounded. But ultimately, the Hospitallers won. They managed to lock down behind their fortifications. They had to obviously engage in a certain amount of retreats. There were some horrific massacres, but they did manage to hold the Ottomans at that line, which to a large degree stopped the Ottoman advance across Europe. It would be Napoleon Bonaparte who would eventually wind the Knights Hospitaller up. He would turn up in Malta in the 1790s, and basically that was the end of the Hospitallers. He also ended the Hospitallers in France, of course, and that was, of course, part of the kind of secular mission of the French Revolution. So where do you find a Knights Hospitaller today? Starbucks, maybe? Down the pub? Where are they? I couldn't resist. Sorry, I just said go on AR. Give me a Knight Hospitaller using a mobile phone. Because obviously, if today, if they're organising a crusade, they'd probably do it on WhatsApp, wouldn't they? So gather in Jerusalem, 10 in the morning, flash mob. So that's how it would be done today. So there's a modern. That's how a crusade would happen today. But today, there are Knight Hospitaller organisations. As with the Templars, there are various and rival organisations claiming to be the real thing. It's a bit like Coca-Cola. So today you have the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, based in Rome. That's a lay Catholic religious order that has observer status at the United Nations. There's a similar Templar one as well called the OSMTH. And I was reading The Economist just last week, as I like to, and lo and behold, The Economist ran an article. The Sovereign Military Order actually met with Pope Francis just last month. So that is today's Hospitallers, a venerable bunch, meeting with the Pope in the Vatican. So they are still going, they still exist. There's the distinctive Maltese cross on their habits. But you also have, of course, the Order of St. John, also known as St. John International here in the UK. And this is a British order of chivalry constituted by Royal Charter in 1888 by Queen Victoria, and it can be found throughout the Commonwealth and the United States, working to prevent sickness and to enhance health. So in other words, the Hospitallers have gone back to their original mission of running hospitals, or running, rather, ambulances. So when you see the St. John ambulance going past, that is basically part of a mission that's been going on since the 11th century. And that's a bit of it's something to conjure in your mind. There. I wanted a dreamy Hospitaller looking at the moon. That just seemed right there. So it's been quite a journey for the Hospitallers, from the Crusades to running an ambulance service, and at one point running a thriving community at Hampton Court Palace. Now, unlike their rivals, the Knights Templar, they are still very much with us today. Sadly, as you know, the Templars came to grief in 1307, rounded up, exterminated, ended, assets stripped, and gone. But the Knights Hospitaller are still with us. Now, somebody will stand up and say, no, hang on a moment, the Templars are still with us. There are neo-Templar organizations, there are Masonic Templars, I've actually met some of these people in the course of doing my Templar stuff, and they all hate each other, by the way, but there you go. But the Hospitaller is still going, and, the benign service of running ambulances, which I think is a great place to end, and I'll throw it open to any questions. Thank you very much.
Can you see me okay? Do we have any questions from the floor about Crusades? Oh, we have one at the back there, good. Or reminiscence about your journey to the various places
yes,
that
yeah.
Tony's mentioned as well.
Yeah. Avignon, Malta, Syria.
Thank you.
Get your photos out.
I just wanted to ask, the Knights Hospitaller in the olden days, did the Pope appoint a leader? How were they structured? Because obviously you had to have somebody in charge of them all.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that came about. Was it a family that provided, like, the leader of the group, or did the Pope appoint somebody, or how did that work?
One of the things that the popes did with the Hospitallers and the Templars was actually ensured that individual kings or individual bishops couldn't appoint the Grand Master or strong arm either of the orders, which is why they were directly accountable to the Pope in Rome. But actually, through their own organizations, with the Templars, their chapter meetings, which escalated up to the kind of big chapter meetings in Jerusalem, they elected their own Grand Master, ditto the Hospitallers. And if you look at both organizations, it's interesting how international, there were Grand Masters from different parts of Europe. Obviously, the French were very dominant in the Templars. Hospitallers, interestingly, recruited a lot in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as France and the Holy Roman Empire. But the Grand Masters, one of the things the Pope ensured was that they could pick the best person. Because think about it, the Grand Master of the Templars, the Grand Master Hospitallers, wasn't just a religious figure, it was also a military figure. It had to be somebody who could actually lead soldiers into battle. It had to be competent. I mean, not being funny, but anybody was and anybody could be elected Pope. I mean, they even had teenagers at one stage in a regressive phase of the church history. But, to be in charge of those military orders, you had to have some ability to lead soldiers. Otherwise, the soldiers were going to get massacred. So I suspect the popes left it largely to the orders to select the best person, who then reciprocated in kind by being ultra-loyal to Rome.
I have a question. Sorry to do this to you.
Go on.
Those people who've been coming to the talks for a while will know that we had an archaeological talk.
Oh, yes.
It was going back probably 2.5 years ago. Do you remember? It was at the AGM, probably back then. Anyway, we talked very clearly about the fact that obviously before the park was enclosed, there's very clear evidence of ridge and furrow system. Now, I'm presuming that they would have given their... That would have been part of the manor system that would have fed the Hospitallers' coffers, would it? Tony?
Yeah, I mean,
so can you explain
so.
a bit about ridge and furrow and what it meant for the poor peasants who were living around this area?
I mean, basically, they were strip farming. They kind of farming in strips. I mean, funny enough, I'm half Portuguese, and I remember in the early 1970s as a child standing on a hill and being able to see strips, that kind of strip farming where people, small holdings, and people are actually often kind of over-exploiting the land, but that medieval form of land division and land usage and and you can still see it in some parts of the English countryside. Obviously now, big estates and so on, but you can still see those ridge and furrows where there were once basically strips of land being farmed by peasants. And also, of course, you will be able to, hopefully more of this will be exposed, be discovered in the years ahead, but you'd also be able to see examples of maybe a dovecot and a buttery and barns and so on. In fact, the only extant Templar barn is at Witham in Essex, and it's still standing, but those would have been barley barns and so on, would have been part of the Hampton complex. So you've got to think of it as a rather, not the kind of idyllic setting you have now. It would have been a busy, I don't want to say industrial, but it would have, agribusiness is the best way to describe it. It would have been a hive of activity, very messy, animals everywhere, people covered in dirt, engaging in basically basic farm work to generate the money, because they then would have traded in goods and services in local markets, raised the wealth, which was then funneled to the Holy Land to buy armor, horses, pay for local mercenaries as well, Turcopoles and the Templars, who didn't fight for nothing.
So if you ever want to go and see, you can see the ridge and furrow system. If you come out of the crocodile exit out of Woodland Gardens, and as though you're heading towards the Diana car park, but look to your right, particularly that strip that goes alongside the Woodland Gardens where the new fencing is, you can actually see the ridge and furrow very clearly, particularly at this time of year. So you can imagine all that area there was all full of peasants out making crops for the Hospitallers.
And you know, another thing particularly about, it's funny because I'm writing this book on the Templars at the moment, which will be out later this year. That sort of plug, but yes, it is really. But but one of the things that annoyed the church authorities and the secular authorities was that they were allowed progressively. The popes actually let them raise their own tithes, raise their own taxes, but in effect exempted people working on Templar and Hospitaller land from taxes to the local lord or the local bishop. It also meant you didn't have to pay the local church to be buried. You could basically do it on Templar land. And one of the things, apparently, when the Templars were wound up, one of the things that annoyed the serfs, the peasants, was they were going to have to start paying taxes. You know, they've been living in tax havens, run by the Templars and the Hospitallers, and suddenly they were going to have to start paying. This has never happened. Since God knows when, 200 years, and that's what they were clobbered for tax. Some angry baron turned up demanding his money.
Thank you. Has that sparked another question? I think.
Do you have an opinion on Royston Cave in Hertfordshire?
Yes, so I've written about Royston Cave before and been there. I mean, I think that a lot of people were initially sceptical, but I think there's a growing body that's prepared to actually say that this parts of it anyway may date back to the Templar period. And
sorry, for those ignorant like me, could you describe what it is to start with?
So it's an artificial cave basically with some very curious images of saints. And Jesus and the Holy Family. I think there's Catherine of Siena, Catherine of Alexandria, sorry, not Siena, and some of the saints that were known to be favoured by the Templars. There's a lot of association between the Templars in particular and caves and tunnels. I mentioned the tunnel at Acre. There's the tunnels in Tomar. There's tunnels at Kerak. There's this kind of idea that the Templars and Hospitallers were heavily into tunnels. Why? The theories, some of them were more esoteric, that they were hiding treasure or that they had secret initiation rituals down there and so on. And in fact, one of the reasons that Royston and other places probably survived is that people continued to have initiation rituals of some kind or another, including the Freemasons, but also Satanists and all sorts of other people ever since. But I think Royston is very likely, at least dates back to the Templar period. If not, it was even used by the Templars. I mean, another theory that I'm ransacking my mind for things that I've done on telly over the years. Another theory was that Templars hid out in these caves after they were crushed in 1307. So I went to see some caves in Wemyss in Scotland, which the locals claim was where the Templars basically came up to Scotland and hid out in the caves and were protected by local Scottish / Viking families. Then if you want to go Curse of Oak Island, they went from Scotland to America. Baldock is a town that was established in Hertfordshire by the Knights Templar. And I don't know if you know the theory that it's supposed to be a corruption of Baghdad. Yeah. And that the reason it was called Baghdad, because Baghdad at the time was the immensely wealthy capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the main Muslim realm at the height of the Islamic civilization, through the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries and so on, before it collapsed. And so the idea was that the Templars called Baldock, that Baldock is this kind of bastardization of the word Baghdad, because they almost wanted to they were hoping, if you want, that Baldock would be as rich as Baghdad. Anyway, I don't know what you've heard is a theory, but I know some people, they say balderdash to that Baldock theory, but that's the theory anyway.
Okay, no more questions? Oh, no, we've got two more. See, this is it. Conversation sparks conversation. We'll have the last two and then we'll go on to notices.
Horace Walpole. So, local celebrity. He built the little Gothic castle of Strawberry Hill House. And he always believed and was proud of the fact that his family took part in the Crusades. Now, none of us that volunteer there have ever seen any evidence of that, but he puts a Saracen's head throughout the house to prove to us that his family took part. And I just wondered, from all of your knowledge and research, is there anything to say which families may or may have not taken part?
Well, just as an FYI, I got married in Strawberry Hill House.
Oh, wow.
So they are just 18 months
Congratulations.
ago. So thank you. And I must admit, that day I didn't. Funny enough, I didn't pay attention so much to Saracen heads. A lot of several of my old friends, because I grew up in northeast London, Jewish, and they were actually talking about a lot of the Jewish connections with Strawberry Hill House. I mean, there are, of course, records, copious records of which noble families went on crusade. And, of course, a lot of the medieval chroniclers, people like William of Tyre, John Mapp, John of Salisbury, and so on, Walter Mapp, sorry, John of Salisbury, name a lot of the nobles. So that there's ample records. And I think, as well, again, I always think on my feet because I'm remembering about 10,000 blog posts I've written over the years. I did actually do a blog post for Americans who wanted to find out if their ancestors had been on crusade. And there are various records, I mean, the Guildhall, and so on, where you can trace back, there are medieval records, and you can have a good go at finding out, whether or not your families were on crusade. I mean, I think for any families that are part of the British nobility that go back to that period, it's highly likely that it had, at least a second son, because typically the people who joined the Templars were the Prince Harrys, basically, the spares. I mean, the first son stayed to run the estate, the second son went on crusade, because, what else are they going to do? They had to find a purpose in life. So, the Hospitallers and Templars were full of Prince Harrys. What am I putting it? No Megans allowed.
I think you've just answered my question. My question was going to be who actually joined Hospitallers or the Templars, and why and how.
I think it's incredible that people, in a way it's incredible, people did join because it was such a hard life. And, there was a kind of vetting process as well. They didn't just let you in just like that. Well, I mean, it's interesting, the Hospitallers did actually initially let people in from non-aristocratic backgrounds, but got more snooty about who could be a knight later on, ditto the Templars to a degree. I mean, there were certain ways that you could get thrown out of both orders, by being in debt, by declaring that you'd been married all along, by doing something else disreputable. But a lot of people wanted to be Templars because they wanted to go to the Holy Land. In fact, one of the things the Templars and Hospitallers used to say to new recruits was, it's not guaranteed that you'll go to the Holy Land. If you join, we might say you have to go and work in that farm, in England, or you have to go and work, some dusty place in the middle of Spain, whatever. So it wasn't guaranteed. You couldn't choose where you want to go to. It wasn't like you had a multiple choice, said, I want to go to the Holy Land first, and, blah, blah, blah. No, it didn't work like that. But there was nevertheless a lot of people wanted to join because I think, certainly in the initial 100 years, let's say, the Templars and Hospitallers were the poster boys of the Crusades. It was exciting, they had their big cross, they were holy, they were warriors. It fitted with the ethos of the time. Now, whether or not the reality on the ground necessarily matched what people thought when they took the cross, to use the expression, but, people kept coming. And after the multiple Crusades, even though the Second Crusade, for example, was a disaster, there was still a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. So, clearly people were still up for crusading. I mean, obviously recruitment dried up once they left the Holy Land, but for a long time it really fitted what, every testosterone-charged medieval male, who wanted a purpose in life, who wanted to travel and see the world as well, to be honest. It was very attractive to go and become a Hospitaller, a Templar. Plus the fact, by the way, you got free board, you had all your equipment paid for. There's actually a very touching description of a Templar who was very jealous about his pillow because he'd never had a pillow before. I mean, you think about it, some of them must have come from quite poor backgrounds. Apparently he cried all night when his pillow had to be washed or something. It's in a book by Professor Alan Nicholson, if you want to look it up. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people wanted to go, and I suppose in a subsistence society where maybe life was incredibly boring, you're in the same village forever, there's this amazing life you can have. Why not,
Thank you, Tony. Can we have another round of applause for Tony? So thank you very much for your time.